Hey, welcome back everyone. Moving on to the next step of the pizza oven. And today we're going to show you how I built this enclosure out of 18 gauge metal studs. Let's get to it. Okay, so we'll take you through the whole structure kind of section by section, pointing out some of the tips and tricks and lessons learned that I found out along the way. And so it'll be a little bit of a long video because I want to go into details of exactly how I went about it. I did not find a lot of great videos and examples out there for this, especially those that have never worked with metal studs before, such as myself. And so I kind of pieced everything together from other videos that I've seen. So hopefully you find the video informative and useful, and if you do, please go ahead and like and subscribe. All right, so getting started, let's first talk about the studs that I used. I used 18 gauge metal studs. Those are considered structural in gauge. You cannot find those at the big box stores, so Lowe's and Home Depot have the more flimsy. I have some of those here, the 20 gauge, and you can see you can bend those quite easily with your hands. You can cut these with snips, no problem. These, on the other hand, are very rigid. You cannot cut those with snips, or at least very easily, if at all, and you do need to use power tools to cut those. I'll go over that in a little bit. So all 18 gauge metal studs, track and studs, and talk a little bit about how I built the walls. And so I, for mine, wanted to make sure that the horizontal beam that would go across the roof for the trusses sat above the insulation. And so you can kind of see that maybe in that shot there, that I needed that to be above the oven. And so what I did was measure my wall height to be the height of the oven plus the thickness of my insulation, which I had 5 inches. And so that's what gave me the wall height I went with, which I believe was somewhere around 31 inches. And so then to cut all of the studs, I used this DeWalt saw over here, and used the metal cutoff blade. And those, I will tell you, these are just the blades that wear, and I'm not sure what they're made out of, but they're meant to wear, and they slowly get smaller and smaller. And you can see this blade is completely almost gone. So in the course, and they cut the studs very well, but you go through a ton of them. And for this enclosure, I think I went through 5 of those 12-inch blades. They're fairly cheap, $7 a blade, so it wasn't really that much of a cost, but just be aware. So I used that miter, DeWalt miter saw to do all the cutting. I set up a jig so I could cut every single stud that I would need all at once to the same height, and so every stud was consistent instead of cutting each one manually. If you cut them manually, you're going to get variations, and I wanted to make sure my top plate was going to be flat all the way around. So I suggest either have a stand, use the stop on the stand, or build a jig so each stud is the same height. Now, to attach the 18 gauge, I used these screws from Grabber. They're 10 by 3/4 inch, self-drilling, and so you have to have a screw that has a drill point on the end, like these do. Just a sharp tip will not go through 18 gauge, and these went through just fine, very easily. Love those screws, worked out great. And then I recommend using an impact driver such as this to put them in. I was using my torque drill that had a torque setting on it. I put it all the way to the max torque, and I felt like it still wasn't getting the screws as tight as possible. I switched to this. I didn't use this at first because I was afraid it would strip out the screws. It does not. So I highly recommend just using your impact on these. Makes quick work of it. And so I used that all the way around on one on the front and one on the back of each stud location to attach it. Some I used 2, just depending on where it was. The more screws you use on the stud, the better and more secure, and more it will resist the lateral forces. All right, so then to attach the walls, and so you can, and probably the right way to do it, is to extend this track out to meet this track. And so this stud is up against this track here. This is 18 gauge and a pain in the butt to cut, so I didn't do that. But if you want to, you can extend this track out, cut this portion of the track out, and so you just basically have this part of the track touching the stud, and then it's easy to kind of attach and drill into that. Since I didn't do that, I went ahead and attached the 2 walls through the bottom track inside the stud, and one here, and then I would attach it at the top, one there and one there, and that secured everything together. So to then attach the walls to the concrete pad, so I did, again, 4.5 inch structural pad that the oven and this structure is going to sit on. And I went back and forth on what I wanted to use to attach it to the actual concrete. My initial plan was just to use some Tapcons maybe with some washers to add some additional pull-out power. And then at the end, right before, I was like, why don't we just, not leave any uncertainty in the stability of the structure. And I ended up going with these 3/4 inch sleeve anchors. Is that what they're called? Yeah. And wedge anchors, sorry. I went with 3/8 inch wedge anchors. And so for those, you just drilled the 3/8 inch hole, tap the anchor in, and then screw it down, and the wedge at the bottom pulls up and locks it into that. And then these you tighten down to 25 foot-pound. And so I just did that all the way around every 3 or so feet. And then in the corners, I try to do 1 on each side of the corner. And so with that then tightened, the structure is extremely solid. So definitely won't be going anywhere. And then I used some gasket just so the concrete wasn't touching the steel directly, to prevent any sort of future rot or rust issues. Cheap, like $10, so cheap insurance. All right, so I think that just about does it for the walls. Maybe the other highlight I will talk about is some of the spans and this arch in the front. So this span right here doesn't have any vertical supports. Obviously it's the opening of the oven, but then it also has part of the chimney directly above it. And I am going to put stone up there. Not going to be a lot of stone, but I don't know, maybe 100 pounds of stone is going to sit up there. Plus the concrete topper, which is going to be another 60. So I wanted to make sure this was beefed up a little bit. So what I did was put a upside down 2x4 in between these two studs and then screwed it in from both sides. And so when you wedge that 2x4 into this top plate, it strengthens this portion up quite a bit to resist any sort of downward flex that it may have, any downward pressures. Then I screwed another top or bottom plate piece into that to create an area that I could attach these studs onto. And then for down here to create this arch, and so I wanted to follow the arch of the oven as best I could. And to do that, to achieve that, I needed this piece to bend. And so my solution to this problem was to take a piece of 20 gauge track. And so this is 20 gauge track, which is much, again, lighter gauge than the rest of that. But I needed it to bend. And so I just went and cut a vertical slice in the front and back leg of the track every 2 inches during the length I needed. And once I did that, then the piece then flexed and bent for me very easily. I then put it into position, put the screws in it, and then also put my small studs, little legs in here just to attach it to the top rail. So once I get cement board screwed to this, it doesn't sag down and fall down. And so that was my approach to the arch on the pizza oven. And then I'll have some stone that wraps around this profile when it's completed, and should look pretty good. So I think that should work. All right, so then let's talk about the chimney portion. And so with this oven, the chimney is very close to the front finished edge. There's like only an inch gap. And so I needed a wall in front of it. So I knew my wall couldn't be any closer than it touching. And I didn't want it to touch this. I didn't want the stud to touch the pipe. And so I left a 1 inch gap. And so that's how I decided where the wall should be. I wanted at least a 1 inch gap here. Then determined how wide it needed to be, and I determined the width because I wanted my width to match the depth. And so based on the depth of leaving this 1 inch gap and the thickness of the stud, I knew I needed 19 and some odd inches. And so I just made the front width match that 19 and some odd inches as well. And then as you can see, I just use studs to create the vertical, then just use this series of top plates at the top. And then for the side piece, connecting those two walls, I just used another piece of track and cut the legs off both ends, kept the legs on the top, and the piece kind of just slid down onto the top. The top then rested on top of the studs, and then the bottoms were cut out to slide over those studs, and I just screwed it into place. And so with that created a pretty solid chimney to hold the backerboard and the stone. Like I said, I'm also going to have a stone cap that's going to be put on, so it does need to hold a little bit of weight. And so then to hold the weight, obviously we've already talked about the front here, so this front wall is bearing, you know, a lot of the weight on that, but then also the back wall of the chimney obviously doesn't have anything to rest against. And so to make this work, I used see if I can get a good shot here. Yeah, I used a full span of the 18 gauge track and screwed that in, and then it's resting on two 14 gauge slotted angled steel. And so the 14 gauge is a lot stronger, so combination of that with the bottom plate, 18 gauge bottom plate, I was able to span this with very little flex, and then have the wall screwed and attached to that, and so far so good. And then I put another track cut out for the middle support where the roof line meets it, so I can have something to screw the cement board onto. And other than that, that's pretty much all that went into the chimney. I might show you the other side here. I might slide an upside down stud here before I close it up. I might slide a stud onto the bottom of this upside down and attach it just to give this even a little bit more structural strength. I don't think I'll need it, but again, that is a large span, and I could have probably used angle iron there, but the 14 gauge slotted steel here seemed to be strong enough. But anyway, that's what I did. Seems to be working just fine. So far so good. All right, and so let's talk about the roof. And so I wanted, I used the metal roof. One, I was already using metal, but also wanted to make sure it wasn't combustible, even though I am using plywood on top of the metal. Wanted to make sure all the framing was non-combustible, so that's why I used metal for the roof as well. So for this, I ended up building some metal trusses out of 8 to 18 gauge studs. And so to show you what I did for that, to make them all the same, and it's important that each one is the same. So first of all, I figured out what pitch I wanted, and so I went with a 10-12 pitch. And so this is what a 10-12 pitch would look like. I'm roughly 61 and a half inches wide, leaving the half-inch setback for my cement board to come flush with this, and so that's important. But but I went with 10-12 on the roof. And so using my speed square, I figured out kind of what that looked like, some trial and error, and I ended up using a template out of some 20 gauge studs I had laying around. Made a template out of that. Then I screwed just some scrap wood I had alongside it into this cement board that's just temporarily sitting here. And then screwed this board onto the bottom with this front board on edge, and I'll show you why that's that way here in a second. But with this, now you're able to use this basically as a jig to create as many roof rafters that you would need very quickly. And so all you need to know is cut your studs to the right length, and then also down here you can see I marked with a marker where the bottom edge of the stud should be and where the side should be. I did that on both sides, there and there. So you just put your studs down. On this particular stud, this one will need to go inside of this one, and so you need to cut a relief on this top stud so this stud can slide into it. And so you either have to bend it or cut it and bend it back if it's light gauge, or cut it off, which I had to do with the heavier gauge steel. But then it's just a matter of sliding them together until you get the studs in the right location on both sides. Make sure it's firmly against each of your side pieces. You're on your jig, and then you clamp it. Again, I used the C-clamp. You stick it in, clamp it, hold it, put some screws in it. Then the last piece is to put the cross brace that will basically attach to each end of your roof. And for that, I just use another stud and lay across. And what this now bottom jig does, you can then lay the stud right against that board and line it up with your edges, make sure it doesn't overhang. And of course this one is not cut to size, but you'd line it up to the right length, make sure it's touching, screw it in here, and then that's all that's to it. You're done. That one's ready to go on the roof. And so notice you don't have to cut the flange here. You can leave this stud all the way whole and leave that leg and just screw it onto the backside, because none of this will be visible. And then this gives it strength, and then you can use this stud as the attachment point onto your top plate of your walls. And this span from where this stud meets this rafter and to where this piece meets this rafter, the distance between those 2 points needs to be equal to the width of your top plate. And so mine's 61.5 inches wide, so I made sure that this horizontal brace is at the point on these rafters where the span between the attachment points is right exactly, or maybe just a little bit more than 61.5. That way, when you put the assembled rafter on your roof, it sits where it should be. It sits up here nice and just barely clears, you can see here, it just barely clears your top plate. And that's how I went about mine. And so I used this jig to create all the rafters that I needed. I think I used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I spaced them like my wall studs every 12 inches. Rafters are spaced every 12 inches. And again, I put, I think, 4 screws or so at the top to secure the 2 studs at the top, and then I used 4 or so to secure the stud to the cross brace. And then underside, maybe here you can see, used a bunch of screws then to secure the cross brace to the top plate. And then that creates a very strong hold, very sturdy. So I assembled those trusses. I put them up first. Then next, once they were up, I came back and put this support in. So I have two, you call them ridge boards maybe. Really what they're to do is to secure the rafters, and so they're kind of locked in place, and so they can't shift or bend laterally. So I have one here that runs the length, and that's screwed into each one, and I have one here that's running the length and screwed into each rafter. And so with those in place, you plumb each rafter and you put a couple screws through it, and that keeps them where they should be. And then, since this is my front overhang, which we'll talk about here in a second, I couldn't bring this forward onto this because this is going to be finished, and so I just used a little piece, screwed it onto the backside of this, and then screwed this to that, and so that really acts as the support for this and secures that front overhang. And so once I did that, I had all the rafters plumb. Then I went ahead and knew I wanted a 12-inch overhang on the front and back, and so I went ahead and measured this this piece. This is a track I used of how long it needed to be, which would be your enclosure depth or size plus a foot on each side, so plus 2 feet. And so I cut that to size and then put that over the ends of the studs and screwed that into place. And if you did everything right, they all should line up pretty well, and this should go on pretty easily. And by chance, mine did go on fairly easily, so that was good news. Then for the front overhangs, so depending on how you build your structure, this could be different, and I have two different approaches, one in the front, one in the back. So in the front, this front rafter is actually sitting and attached to the front of the structure. I couldn't set it back because that's where the chimney is. And so I had no choice but to attach it to the front. And so then, to give this enough strength, I attached it to the chimney structure. It's also attached to these trusses, or these supports that's running the length of the roof. But then also, I built this little wall that follows the grade, the pitch of the roof, behind this, that has mini studs in it cut. That's all screwed in. That then this joist, roof rafter, whatever you want to call it, then can be screwed into. And I screwed that every 6 or so inches into that, so that's nice and secure. Then once you have that, you need to produce your overhang. And notice here I used studs again, right, for all of my rafters, and I needed to be able to connect those two. And if you know, your track is what the studs are meant to be sit inside of. A stud is not meant to sit inside of another stud. So this is where it got kind of messy, is to make this work, you have to mark your stud location on each of these, and you have to cut little tabs out of the front of both pieces that you're going to attach for your overhang. And that's so you can take these little studs and slide them into each stud that is not meant to hold a stud inside of it. And so once you do this, though, they go in pretty easily. Once it's screwed in place, it is rock solid. I've actually hung myself purposefully off of it just to kind of test its strength, and it was able to hold me up without any give or any flex. So I'm confident in its strength. And then if I go around to the back, and here is the back, and you can see we have a slightly different approach. Since I didn't have a chimney here, I was able to build a full wall on this back to match the pitch of the roof cut these at an angle, screwed everything together, and now you can see this back rafter is actually sitting on top of the wall now, which makes it a little bit more secure. And then just cut. Again, same approach, cut tabs, put little small studs in between, and screwed it all together. That has worked well. And so then, you know, what I found to install this piece to be easiest is to, once you secure this and you're going to build this piece off on your jig like I showed earlier, is to then unscrew it and have the two pieces actually be separate, and then put this piece on first and get it fairly secure, and then you take this piece that sits over the top, start at the bottom and work your way up, and it'll then slide over the piece that is meant to be inside of it. And the reason you want to do that is it is really hard to line up all of these studs, especially when you have this V shape. And so when you unscrew it, you do one each individually, and then once you have them both in place, put the screws back in. And that also lets you know you have it set right, because the holes should line back up. And if the holes line back up, the screws go right back in and you're done. So that's another tip that I recommend as I was trying to put this on. It seemed a lot easier. And then the last maybe part I'll mention is the wiring. I am putting 2 sconces in. I just put it in the center between the oven opening and the edge. I'm using just regular grommets because it's inside an enclosure, but make sure you buy these grommets for your steel studs so the wire doesn't get cut as you're putting it through. So I think that's a wrap for the steel enclosure that I built. You have any questions, comments, go ahead and put them down below. Be happy to answer anything I didn't talk about on the video. But couple learnings. They're difficult to work with, but create a very solid structure. Buy lots of those disposable blades. You're going to go through a lot. Buy lots of screws. I probably used close to 800 or so screws, self-drilling. Have lots of batteries for your drills. You're going to go through a lot. And then from a timeline standpoint, this probably took me 18 hours, I would say. So have some time set aside for it. All right, I think that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, everyone, and check back next time.